to get safe. They never called downstairs and said there's a fire. They knew there was a fire before. And so by the time the girls realized it was kind of too late. So they started, who just said, they said there was one stairwell, the other one, the door was locked. The fire escape, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And we'll figure
take
that
it
out
off
later.
after.
Yeah, thanks. The fire escape fell apart. It was so old and rusty that when all the girls got on it, the whole thing came away from the wall and crashed to the ground. When the fire department came, the hose only reached to the 6th floor and the fire was on the 8th and 9th floors. And you know, did you ever see the firemen when they have like a big net to catch people? They were telling girls to jump and the net was so old and it hadn't been inspected that it was like dry rotted. So when the weight of the girls came, they fell through and died anyway. And then, so then people tried to go down the elevator and so much so that the elevator was starting to break and some girls even jumped down the shaft because it was so hot and they died that way. So if you didn't die in the fire, you fell off the fire escape, you fell down the elevator shaft, or you jumped out the window. So a lot of them, do you guys remember footage from 9/11?
Yeah.
Okay, so people, it's like, do I burn to death or do I jump? So people started jumping. Some of them were on fire and jumping. So it was like the people who saw it. So these are some of the girls, these are some of the bodies. So in the end, 146 people died, mostly girls. There were a few men that worked there. The average age was probably your age. I think the youngest girl was 14. They were mostly teenage girls from Jewish immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe, and Italian girls from Italy. So what ends up happening is all but 6 girls are claimed. So there were so many bodies that they couldn't put them in the morgue because there wasn't enough room. So they went to this pier in New York and put the bodies out and put an ad in the newspaper. If your daughter, your wife, your girlfriend, your sister didn't come home from work last night, please come identify her body. So they did. They had to use dental records. They had to use jewelry to see if, oh, that's my wife, that's her ring, because they couldn't, because of the burning, they couldn't see them. So in the end, there were 6 girls who were never claimed because they were immigrants who came here by themselves. So the city of New York took up a collection and buried them, gave them a proper funeral. One girl survived jumping and lasted like a week and then died at the end of the week. So there was all told, 146 that died. So very, very tragic. The 2 men were put on, the owners who locked the doors, were put on trial for manslaughter, and they were acquitted because they felt it couldn't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt that they knew the doors were locked, but they did, they locked them. So, they gave a settlement of $75 to every girl's family, which, what are you gonna do with that? With the dead child and $75. So super sad. However, the upside, what if any upside do you think there might be to this story? What do you think, Stowe?
Movement for better labor laws for
Good.
women and just in general.
Excellent, excellent. Is that what you guys were gonna say? So this is what happened. So people who saw this happen were dedicated their lives to reforming labor. In fact, one lady, Frances Perkins, was one lady who we're gonna talk about again. She was a garment worker herself. These are called garment workers when you work in the clothing industry. Frances Perkins was a garment worker herself. She happened to be off that day or on a break or something, and she was just hanging out on the streets of New York and saw this and never forgot it. And she dedicated her life to labor reform, and she's actually the first female cabinet member, and FDR makes her the Secretary of Labor in the 1930s. So she said, if you saw that, you would never forget it. And she said, I couldn't do anything with the rest of my life except work to reform working conditions. So it really impacts people. Another lady, Rose Schneiderman, she's gonna see it and she's gonna badger the city of New York to have better fire codes. So girls, this is an example of 2 things. One is working conditions that are terrible. 2 is public health and safety that is bad. The city of New York grew so big, so fast, that the fire department couldn't keep up with it. If you go to New York today, New York City has some of the strictest fire codes that there are, because Rose Schneiderman and other people in New York fought to say, okay, you have to go and inspect the fire escape. You have to have hoses that reach higher than they do. So they just didn't know. They hadn't had an experience. So, you know, today if you go somewhere, it'll say maximum occupancy. Like you can't, everybody has to have a way to get out. Fire drills, things like that, people didn't know. What's something today? Can you think of a modern day example where something so tragic happened that it changed the way people do things? Ellie?
After 9/11, we called the airport security.
Excellent, very good, excellent. Before 9/11, which is before your time, how old were you guys born?
Yeah.
You were like 1, right? Yeah.
2 months old.
2?
No, I was like 2 months old.
Oh, 2 months old. Okay. Yeah. So, right, so you don't remember, but before that, you could roll up to the airport, you know, half hour before your flight and go through security, no problem. Now you have to get there so much earlier, take off your belt, you're this, you're that. So all that stuff came from because of 9/11. What else? Joanne?
Well, the shooting a couple weeks ago, and now,
Go
I
ahead.
mean, we already have like these drills and stuff like that, but I know every school's like taking their drills and stuff like that. Like,
Absolutely, absolutely. And the sad part is, like, for as long as I've been teaching about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, it was always Columbine was the example, which was in the 90s, and now there's so many more. Then it was Sandy Hook, now it's sad. But with each of those things, it's become more strict. I noticed a lot after the Sandy Hook tragedy, right? That's when I know where my kids go to school, they added a little vestibule where you have to go in and there's bulletproof glass, and then if you get past there, then you can go in, and it's become a lot more strict. So I imagine even now things are going to change and have because of the last tragedy in Florida. So things like that, they are horrible. And it's sad that that's what has to happen sometimes. So there's a bunch of things. What else, Jess?
I was gonna say the Boston Marathon bombing.
Good, very good. So now when you have a big event like that, the security is a lot tighter. And I think the next year at the Boston Marathon, it was really,
It was really intense.
yeah. You know, and maybe things will change with gun control, I don't know. But there's been things like even Megan's Law to register sex offenders. That was something that came out of a horrible situation. You know, there is some gun limitations as far as buying them that you have to do. I think that was Brady's Law because of a politician that got shot by someone. So there are little things, but sadly, that's the outcome. At least you know that at least somebody's going to do something, you would hope. So that's very true of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So people felt like, don't let these girls have died in vain. I think people felt more upset because they were so young and they were girls. They thought they were helpless, young girls who barely spoke English, they didn't understand, and it made it more tragic. During that time period, people viewed girls that way. Okay, I'm not saying you guys are helpless because you're the same age, but that's how they felt. So, this has to do with the temperance movement. A lot of women blamed men for poverty and violence, domestic violence, all their problems they blamed on drinking. Okay, so that's going to be a progressive thing. So, Teddy Roosevelt, this is what I was talking about before. So his idea of the square deal is the 3 C's, control corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. Teddy Roosevelt is the first president to really look at conservation as a national issue, right? Nobody really was into conserving anything, and he is saying, we need to plant more trees. We need to, we keep consuming everything. We need to start putting back, okay? And even the national park system, national monuments, he was instrumental in doing all of that stuff, okay? And the term so Teddy Roosevelt loves to coin little phrases. He's kind of an interesting guy. And when he worked out this deal with the coal miners went on strike, and it was right before winter. And he was like, okay, what's the problem? Let's just solve this. Like, he was the kind of president, and think of it this way, girls, he's coming on the heels of all those laissez-faire presidents who didn't really get involved. And here he is going, okay, well, what do we need to do? And he would literally roll up his sleeves and get involved. And when the coal miners went on strike, he negotiated between the owners of the mine and the miners and said, what do we need to do? Let's just get it done. So he didn't get them everything that they wanted, but he did get them a compromise so they would go back to work. But his point in doing that was, it was too cold. Like you don't have the luxury of going on strike. Most people heated their homes with coal. So get back to work. What can we do? So he's very, very hands-on, very progressive. So when this deal was done, he went like this and was like, okay, everyone got a square deal. So he means a fair deal, and he means, he said you get what you get, nothing more, nothing less. Okay, he's not into like a free ride. He's just into people getting what they deserve. Okay, so that's the square deal, and it became his campaign slogan. Now, how does Teddy Roosevelt come to the presidency? Maybe we talked about this already. Nora?
Wasn't McKinley shot,
Good.
assassinated, so he was the vice president, so he became the president.
Good. And the Republicans kind of wanted to stifle him. They put him in the position of vice presidency because they felt he was too progressive. The Republicans were like, all right, pick him as your running mate, and then, McKinley ends up getting killed, and now he's the president. So he has a tremendous amount of power to be very progressive. And Teddy has little respect for checks and balances. He's really into I'm the executive branch, and he also is not into strict construction. If it doesn't say in the Constitution that you can't do it, then maybe he won't, but he's not going to be one to really worry about what it says in the Constitution, okay? So he becomes president in 1901. In 1904, then, that square deal thing became his political platform, okay? All right, so that is that. Okay, and I think Ellie mentioned in the homework that the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act were two things. So girls, was the Interstate Commerce Act already done by now? Yes, right? And what is the Interstate Commerce Commission supposed to do? What is their job? Harriet?
They're supposed to regulate trade between the states.
Good. So where business crosses state lines, the ICC is supposed to oversee it. Once again, people are getting by, loopholes, all that. They weren't really very effective. So when Teddy Roosevelt became president, he passed the Elkins Act and the Hepburn Act to control the railroads. The railroads were out of hand. So the Elkins Act fought the idea of giving rebates to the best customers, and then the Hepburn Act restricted free passes. So what was that? This kind of goes back to populism, and this is something you could allude to in your paper to get the synthesis point. The idea with the populists was for the government to control the railroads, because the railroad business was abusing the farmers, and what they were doing was giving better pricing and rebates to the larger farmer, so it was hurting the little guy. So Teddy Roosevelt, this goes against his idea of taking care of the consumer. So he did this to help the consumers of the railroad, okay, which are farmers. Does that make sense? Yes? Good? Okay. All right, so that's that. Did we already talk about this during, I think I told you this before when we talked about the Gilded Age, when we talked about J.P. Morgan, Teddy Roosevelt sues him. Teddy Roosevelt, as the U.S. government, sues him for violating the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the U.S. government wins. So this is a big deal. So Teddy Roosevelt took on the most wealthiest man that there was, and he won. And his point was, you can't form a trust. So the thing I want you guys to know, though, about Teddy Roosevelt, he does not dislike business. He likes big business. He's a wealthy man himself. He grew up in New York very wealthy, with a very wealthy family who made a lot of money in big business. So he's not anti-business, he's anti-corruption, and he's anti-bad trust. So he's going to be, we call it trust busting. He's going to break up, I think it's 40-some companies that kind of like J.P. Morgan. So he tackled the biggest and most powerful one first to kind of show, okay, I'm not messing around, because the Clayton Antitrust Act is not going to exist until Wilson. So the Clayton Antitrust Act is going to fix all the loopholes in the Sherman Antitrust Act, but this doesn't happen until Wilson, so we're 2 presidents away from that. So Teddy Roosevelt used what he had to work with, which was Sherman, which was not a great law, but he went after the big corporations that were the most corrupt. Now Taft, when he becomes president, he breaks up like 70 trusts, and Teddy Roosevelt gets kind of annoyed with him and feels like he's almost impending business because he's too much of a trust buster. Like he's almost being anti-business by breaking up too many. Okay? All right, so here's a cartoon you'll see a lot, girls. So Teddy Roosevelt was an avid hunter. Do we talk about him personally at all? I feel like I say this stuff about him all the time. Maybe I already said it. Did I tell you how his wife and his mother died on the same day in the same house? Okay, and then he went on a hunt for like years. He was an avid outdoorsman, an avid hunter. So what is this cartoonist saying about Teddy Roosevelt? Yes, he's a hunter, but what else? What's his thoughts on? Go ahead, Ellie.
He's not like trying to like kill all the business, just the
Good.
bad.
Good. And what's he doing with the other trusts? What's he keeping them on?
Leashes.
Yeah, he's kind of got a restraint on them. He's keeping them on a short leash and he's keeping an eye on them, the good trusts, but he's not going to kill them. It's the bad trusts that he's trying to do away with. Okay, so this kind of tells us his philosophy. So that's a typical one. You'll see a lot like that of him. Okay, so I think we talked about the jungle. A little bit. Did we read excerpts from the jungle? Okay, let's jump. I have some because you really have to kind of read it. It's disgusting.
I've read that.
That's so gross.
G. Yes. Thank you. You hot? I have to give you a can. Girls, if you go into Canvas and go into module, I think there's a thing in the jungle. We'll look at it together.
Feel better.
Feel
better.
What's today is the next.
I feel like you would eat it all.
I didn't eat it all the time, but I did have it.
What is that? That sounds interesting.
All right. All right, girls. So if you go into the module, I don't know, this is not cooperating with me right now. Do you see an excerpt from the jungle, like a hyperlink? Sometimes my arrow disappears.
It's under period 7. It's like pretty far.
Oh, I have to see it.
Bless you.
So gross.
Oh my gosh.
So girls, here it is here. Oh, sorry. There is a hyperlink. If you click on it,
Oh wait, you're my spam.
Oh, that's gonna be on the video. Buttermilk? The birthday was happening on the last. Yeah. I don't like that, but I guess someone it's the worst.
all right, girls, did everybody pull that up?
Poor girl.
Okay, so basically, we're gonna read this together, some of the excerpts. Okay, so we're not gonna read the intro, but basically, I think I told you Upton Sinclair was a writer for a socialist magazine, and they tasked him with going in and observing the working conditions and writing an article about it. And he got so much information that he was like, I'm writing a novel. So what ends up happening is it turns into a best-selling novel, and he wanted to really get people to feel sorry for the workers and their conditions, but what people took away from it was, that's disgusting, I eat meat and I'm consuming this meat, I'm concerned. So that's what ends up being the focus. And guess who reads the book? Did we talk about this? Who reads a book a day even when he's president? Teddy Roosevelt reads the book and he's like, holy cow, this is gross. He sends inspectors to Chicago to say, he said, go and see what, it can't be this bad. There's no way. This guy is exaggerating to sell books. Like, there's no way. So the inspectors go and they came back and they were like, it's actually worse. It's actually worse than what he described. So Chicago is what we call a packing town, which is where, remember we talked about, I showed you guys the map, they would herd, the cowboys would herd the cattle up north, like ranchers would, and that they would end up in places like Chicago and Kansas City, and that's where the slaughterhouses are. And the conditions are absolutely filthy because there were no laws. There were no laws on what you had to do. So let's read some of this together. So who wants to read? We won't do like popcorn, but like if you are a person who doesn't mind reading, you can start with Silver Men in the Pickle Room. We didn't read this, right?
Here in Class Girls is where we read this together. You can read this on your own if you go onto Canvas. In the module for period 7, there is a hyperlink that says The Jungle, and it's a couple of excerpts from different progressives. You want to read the one that is the excerpt from Upton Sinclair's The Jungle.
You may also fast forward.
Yes, we're probably just.
Go ahead, Nora.
There were men in the pickle rooms.
Girls.
It's
Go ahead,
like
Nora.
under.
There were
It's
men in
toward
the
the
pickle
top.
rooms, for instance, where old Astanis had gotten his death. Scarce a one of these that had not some spot of horror on his person. Let a man so much as scrape his finger pushing a truck in the pickle rooms, and he might have a sore that would put him out of the world. All the joints in his fingers might be eaten by the acid, one by one. I'm sorry, I'm of the butchers and the floormen, the beef boners and trimmers, all of those who use knives. You could scarcely find a person
Pull it together.
who had the use of his thumb. Time and time again, the base of it had been slashed, till it was a mere lump of flesh against which the man pressed his knife to hold it.
Good. Okay. Somebody else? You good, Nora?
Yeah, I'm
Go
fine.
ahead.
I just laugh when I'm really uncomfortable.
You're doing great. Good. We're gonna edit this part out, so
The
don't worry
hands-
about being recorded.
The hands of actually keep it in. The hands of these men would be crisscrossed with cuts until you can no longer pretend to count them or to trace them. They would have no nails. They had worn off the pulling hides. Their knuckles were swollen so that their fingers spread out like a fan. There were men who worked in the cooking rooms, in the midst of steam and sickening odors by artificial light. In these rooms, the germs of tuberculosis might live for 2 years, but the supply was renewed every hour. There were beef luggers who carried 200-pound quarters into the refrigerator cars, a fearful kind of work, that began at 4 o'clock in the morning, and that wore out the most powerful men in years. There were those who worked in the chilling rooms, and whose special disease was rheumatism. The time limit that a man could work in these chilling rooms was said to be 5 years. There were the wool pluckers, whose hands went to pieces even sooner than the hands of the picklemen, for the pelts of the sheep had to be painted with acid to loosen the wool, and then the pluckers had to pull out this wool with their bare hands until the acid had eaten off their fingers. There were those. Oh, am I good?
You good? Does somebody else want to give Nora a break? Stowe, go for it. Thank you, Nora.
Where did we leave off?
There were those who made the tins, like, okay,
Yeah, I got it. There were those who made the tins for the canned meat, and their hands too were a maze of cuts, and each cut represented a chance for blood poisoning. Some worked at stamping machines, and it was very seldom that one could work long there at the pace that was set, and not give out and forget himself, and have a part of his hand chopped off. There were the hoisters, as they were called, whose task it was to press a lever which lifted the dead cattle off of the floor. They ran along upon a rafter, peering down through the damp and the steam. And as old Durham's architects had not built the killing room for the convenience of the hoisters, at every few feet they would have to stoop under a beam, say 4 feet above the one they ran on, which got them into the habit of stooping so that in a few years they would be walking like chimpanzees. Worst of any, however, were the fertilizer men, and those who served in the cooking rooms. These people could not be shown to the visitor, for the odor of the fertilizer man would scare any ordinary visitor at 100 yards. And as for the other men, who worked in tank rooms full of steam, and in some of which there were open vats near the level of the floor, their peculiar trouble was that they fell into the vats, and when they were fished out, there was never enough of them left to be worth exhibiting. Sometimes they would be overlooked for days till all but the bones of them had gone out to the world as Durham's pure leaf lard.
Okay. So what is he saying in that last part there? So sometimes the workers would fall into the vats of boiling water to make the steam, and they would be cooked and packaged in with the
bad.
So yeah. So that was a problem. There's other excerpts that talk about
That's a lot.
rats. There's rats all over, right? So, girls, do you see how people read this and thought, oh God, I used that lard? You know what lard is, right?
Yeah.
It's like animal fat. I used that product, and people became sickened by the thought of eating potentially rat, whatever, and human flesh. But his point was the working conditions. So, if you ever have a chance to read, it is a very good book. The main character, it talks about all the woes of his life, but like they were saying, you get a little cut and you could die, like blood poisoning. That happened to one of the characters in the book. I think it was a girl. She got a cut and couldn't afford a doctor, and she ends up dying from a little cut on her finger. So the working conditions are horrible, but the sanitary conditions are worse. So that's what Teddy Roosevelt fixated on too, was like, oh my gosh, we have to do this. So it leads to the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. Okay, so today, you know, when you buy food, you can feel confident that it's clean, right? So totally disgusting. But, and girls, if you think about this book, if you think about like Uncle Tom's Cabin, and I'm not comparing like unsanitary conditions to slavery, but when you make something a novel and people read it, they become more emotionally attached to it. So Upton Sinclair, he could have just wrote an article, right? But not as many people would have read it, and they wouldn't have become emotionally attached to the situation. So it's kind of like Uncle Tom's Cabin in that it took a really bad situation that was a true situation, but by making it a piece of fiction, there were characters that Americans could become sympathetic toward, and that was very effective. So that's what happens. So if you read this story, the main character is this guy Eurus, and he, what he goes through is heart-wrenching, and that's what Upton Sinclair wanted people to gravitate toward, but what they gravitated toward was the unsanitary conditions. So the Meat Inspection Act, and girls, this book was published in 1906. The Meat Inspection Act was passed in 1906. So that tells you how progressive Teddy Roosevelt was and how concerned he was to do something quickly. Okay, and if you ever want to read the rest of these are other progressives that are speaking. So you can get out of that now. I just want you guys to read that. And that's not the grossest of the gross. There's other excerpts that are more repulsive than that one, believe it or not, that talk about rat excrement and nasty stuff. Yes. So, did I get out of that?
That was Nora.
All right.
Is it reading that give you scurvy?
Yes.
So that's the jungle. So girls, this is supposed to be the after. So to us, this probably looks gross still, but this is supposed to be after the Meat Inspection Act. Here are the inspectors going out, and you can see, like today, by today's standards, this is still kind of nasty.
Oh no.
But anyway.
Improvement.
About
So, all right, girls. One of the other things, if you decide to write about conservation in your paper, as far as the progressives go, Teddy Roosevelt does do a lot in conservation. That was on their agenda, but of the progressive presidents, Teddy Roosevelt was really the only one who did much. Taft totally drops the ball. He doesn't really care too much about conservation, and Wilson really doesn't do much with it either. So if you do talk about it, there's a lot of acts in here that you could include. It's not wrong. You could totally do it, but attribute it all to Teddy Roosevelt. But he works on irrigation, national park system. He sets up the Forest Reserve Act. There's a lot of things that he does to help make the environment more productive for future generations. His concern was if we keep using trees and we don't plant more, we're going to eventually run out, which makes a lot of sense, right? But nobody thought that way back then. Nobody used the word conservation. You guys grew up in a recycle mindset, right? Recycle, you wouldn't just throw something in the trash that's plastic or a can or something. That's your generation. Like even back then, people didn't think about conserving anything at all. They didn't think that way. Okay? So these are some of the things that he does. So you can put the forest system. The Newlands Reclamation Act was an irrigation project. So you could talk about any of those things. Okay, and this is him with John Muir. I think John Muir might have been one of your words that you had to know. He was an environmentalist of the day, and Teddy Roosevelt was good friends with him. So even though Teddy Roosevelt was a hunter, like you think of a hunter as someone like not conserving the environment, he was a respectful hunter. Okay? All right, girls, so we'll finish this up. Check Canvas. We're going to try and stick with the calendar, okay, which is FRQ and test next week. Okay, consecutively.
It doesn't matter that like 99.999% because that's 0.2. About this time. Probably something I agree with.
Yeah, sure. Can you turn, thanks, Catherine.